All right, strap in, everyone, because today we are tackling a philosophical doozy, something for those of you who like to really get those brain gears turning.
I'm ready. Bring it on.
Okay, so we are taking a deep dive into the problem of evil.
Ah, yes, a classic.
A classic indeed, but that doesn't make it any less puzzling, right? I mean, if there really is a God, one who is all-powerful and all-good,
Right.
then how can there be so much suffering and bad stuff happening in the world? It seems like a straight-up contradiction.
It's a question that's kept philosophers and theologians up at night for centuries, for sure.
And to make our lives even more interesting today, we're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on the problem of evil as our guide.
We do like to make things challenging for ourselves, don't we? That entry is, well, let's just say it's pretty dense.
Dense is putting it mildly, but hey, that's what this deep dive is all about.
Exactly.
Breaking down these complex ideas and pulling out the most interesting and thought-provoking bits, make it something we can all wrap our heads around.
I think what's fascinating to me is just how many different ways philosophers have framed this problem. I mean, there's not just one way to look at it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And before we even get into the different arguments, I think it's super important to be clear about what we even mean by God in this context.
Right, because God can mean a lot of different things to different people.
So how does the Stanford Encyclopedia define it?
Well, they lay out a couple of main definitions.
Okay.
The first one is what they call the metaphysical definition.
Metaphysical. So we're getting into the really abstract stuff now.
We are. I think of it as like God as the ultimate cause of everything, the ground of being, the necessary, being very philosophical.
So not so much a personal God who, answers prayers and intervenes in our lives, but more like the ultimate source of existence itself.
Yeah, exactly. Now, contrast that with the more religious definition of God.
Which I'm guessing is the one that's more familiar to most people.
Probably, yeah. This is God as a powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being. The kind of God who's worthy of worship, who's actively involved in the world and wants good to win out over evil.
And that's where the tension really starts to ramp up, right?
Right.
Because if God is all those things, all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, then how in the world can we explain all the suffering we see? Like, wouldn't a God like that be able to stop it? And wouldn't he want to?
That, my friend, is the heart of the problem of evil.
And the Stanford Encyclopedia doesn't shy away from it.
Not at all.
It goes on to map out all the different philosophical paths people have taken to try and, well, reconcile these seemingly contradictory ideas.
It's a real philosophical jungle out there.
It is. And the encyclopedia even categorizes the arguments against God's existence based on the existence of evil, which I found really helpful.
Oh, yeah. Breaking it down like that makes it much easier to follow.
So one of the first big distinctions they make is between what they call incompatibility arguments and evidential arguments.
Right. Two very different approaches.
So incompatibility arguments, those try to show that the existence of evil is completely incompatible with the existence of God. Like the two just can't logically coexist at all.
Yeah, it's like trying to say that a square is also a circle. It just doesn't make sense.
So if an incompatibility argument is right, then believing in both God and evil would be like believing in something totally nonsensical.
Exactly. And a really common example of this type of argument is the one that says, okay, if God is all good and all powerful, he wouldn't allow any evil to exist, right? But evil does exist, so therefore a God who is both all good and all powerful can't exist.
Yeah, that one's pretty straightforward, but I can already see where someone might push back.
Oh, for sure.
Because isn't it assuming that we as humans can actually grasp all the possible reasons why God might allow suffering? I mean, what if there are reasons that are just beyond our comprehension?
You've hit on a major sticking point with incompatibility arguments. They seem to require us to have like a God's eye view of the universe, which is a pretty tall order for us limited beings.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so then what about evidential arguments? How do those work?
So instead of going for that knockout punch, proving God can't exist, evidential arguments are more subtle.
Okay.
They basically try to show that the existence of evil makes God's existence less likely or less probable.
So it's more like a nudge in one direction rather than a slam dunk.
Exactly. They acknowledge that maybe we don't have the whole picture, but they point to very specific examples of suffering that just seem completely pointless and unjustified,
So instead of saying this proves God can't exist, they're saying this makes it seem less likely that a good and powerful God would allow this to happen.
Exactly. And I think because they focus on real, tangible suffering, they tend to hit us harder, emotionally speaking.
Oh, for sure.
They force us to confront the question. If God really is good, why would he allow this particular horrible thing to happen? It's one thing to say there's evil in the world.
Right. It's very different from describing like a fawn trapped in a forest fire or a child dying a slow and painful death from some terrible disease.
Exactly. You bring up a great point there.
I do.
Yeah, because there's also this distinction between talking about evil in the abstract versus focusing on concrete examples of suffering. And I think that really changes how we think about the problem.
Yeah, when you talk about evil in general, it can feel kind of distant, but when you get specific, when you describe a real case of suffering, it's much harder to ignore.
Absolutely. It becomes more personal. It forces you to ask, if there's a loving God, why would he allow this specific awful thing to happen to this innocent creature? You know?
He brings the whole problem down to earth.
Exactly. It takes it out of the realm of philosophical theory and makes us face the real world consequences of evil.
Wow, my head is already spinning and we've only just scratched the surface.
Oh, we're just getting started. The Stanford Encyclopedia goes even deeper, pointing out that the problem of evil can be formulated in different ways depending on how you define good and bad.
Oh boy, even more layers to this. Okay, I'm game. Let's hear it.
They talk about something called axiological formulations and deontological formulations, which sounds super complicated but are actually pretty interesting.
Okay, lay it on me. What's the difference?
So axiological formulations, those judge actions based on their outcomes. So you might argue that if God allows something terrible to happen and the ultimate outcome isn't some huge positive good, then God acted wrongly.
But wouldn't that require us to be able to calculate, like, the overall goodness or badness of the universe? That seems impossible.
It's really tricky, right? And a lot of theologians would argue that we just can't possibly comprehend the full scope of God's plan.
Right, so judging outcomes is way beyond our pay grade.
Pretty much, yeah. So axiological formulations, while interesting, might not be the most productive way to think about this problem.
Gotcha. Okay, so then what about deontological formulations?
So those focus on the morality of the action itself, regardless of its outcome.
So instead of asking, did this action lead to the best result, you're asking, was this action morally right or wrong on its own?
Exactly. So a deontological formulation might say, okay, regardless of what good might eventually come from it, is it morally justifiable for God to allow, this particular instance of suffering to happen, like, say, a child being tortured?
I can see how that avoids getting bogged down in trying to measure the overall goodness of the universe.
Yeah, it shifts the focus to the morality of specific actions and whether those actions fit with our idea of a perfectly good God.
This is so intricate. We've covered different definitions of God, different types of arguments, and now these axiological versus deontological frameworks, and we've barely even scratched the surface of the Stanford Encyclopedia entry.
And we haven't even gotten to the really juicy stuff yet.
There's more.
Oh, yeah. We still have to dive into the different ways philosophers have tried to actually respond to the problem of evil, and that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, I am both excited and terrified at the same time, but lead the way. I'm ready for more.
All right, well, buckle up because things are about to get even more philosophically intense.
Can't wait.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the problem of evil, where we are wrestling with one of the biggest philosophical dilemmas out there.
My brain is already doing some serious weightlifting after our last discussion.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack, isn't it? Last time we explored those arguments that pit the existence of suffering against the concept of a benevolent and all-powerful God.
We did. And it was fascinating to see how many different ways philosophers have framed this problem.
It's a testament to how complex the issue really is.
But now I'm really curious to hear how people have actually tried to respond to these arguments.
Okay, yeah, so how do we make sense of this apparent contradiction? How do we square the idea of a good God with all the bad stuff that happens in the world?
Right. Are there any good answers out there? Or are we just stuck with this impossible dilemma?
Well, luckily for us, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy doesn't just lay out the problem. It also dives into the various responses that have been proposed over the centuries.
Okay, that's good to hear, because I'm eager for some potential solutions.
All right, so they basically categorize the main responses into three main groups: total refutations, theodicies, and defenses.
All right, let's break those down. Total refutations, those sound pretty bold, like someone's just saying, nope, this whole problem of evil thing is just wrong.
You got it. A total refutation aims to show that the argument from evil is just flawed from the start, that facts about evil don't actually give us any evidence against God's existence.
Okay, but how could you possibly argue that the existence of suffering doesn't challenge the idea of a loving God? That seems like a tough sell.
Well, one common strategy is to appeal to human limitations.
Okay.
It's basically saying that we humans are just too puny, too small-minded to grasp God's reasons for allowing evil.
So like the classic, God works in mysterious ways kind of thing.
Yeah, kind of. It's like saying, look, God's ways are beyond our understanding. We can't possibly comprehend why he does what he does.
Hmm. I don't know about that, to be honest. It feels a bit like a cop-out. Like we're just giving up before we even really try to understand.
I get that, and a lot of philosophers find that approach intellectually unsatisfying too. It doesn't really engage with the specific instances of suffering that make the problem so troubling.
Yeah, it's just a blanket statement that doesn't really address the nitty-gritty of the issue.
Exactly. So what about other types of total refutations?
Yeah, what else have people come up with?
Well, another one argues that there's no such thing as the best possible world.
Okay, what does that mean?
So the idea is that for any given world, no matter how good it is, you could always imagine a world that's even better, right? So the fact that our world isn't perfect, that it could be improved, doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't created by a perfect being.
So even God, with all his power and goodness, can't create a world that's like the ultimate best. There's always room for improvement.
That's the gist of it, yeah? But of course, you could also say, well, even if there's no absolute best possible world, we're still left with the problem of suffering in this world, and that needs to be addressed.
Right, it doesn't really solve the problem of why there's so much pain and suffering right here, right now.
You're right. It kind of sidesteps the issue a bit, doesn't really deal with the emotional and moral weight of the suffering we actually experience.
Okay, what about that third type of total refutation, the one that uses the ontological argument?
Ah, yes, the ontological argument, that old chestnut. That one's a classic attempt to prove God's existence through pure logic.
Oh, right. I remember learning about that in philosophy class.
It basically starts with the definition of God as a perfect being, and then argues that existence itself is a perfection, so a perfect being must exist.
Okay, so if that argument is sound, then God's existence would be logically necessary, and the problem of evil wouldn't even apply.
Right, but the problem is that most philosophers don't actually find the ontological argument all that convincing. It relies on some pretty specific assumptions about existence and logic that not everyone agrees with.
So it's like trying to define God into existence.
You could say that, yeah, it's a clever argument, but it hasn't really put the problem of evil to rest.
Okay, so it seems like total refutations haven't really been all that successful.
Not really, no. They're ambitious, but they don't quite do the trick. So let's move on to the next category. Theodicies.
Okay, theodicies, those are the ones that actually try to explain why God allows
Mm.
evil, right?
Exactly. And instead of trying to dismantle the argument from evil, theodicies try to make sense of suffering. They want to show that it's actually compatible with God's goodness and power.
So it's more like, okay, evil exists, but here's why a good God might allow it, right?
Exactly. And there are a ton of different theodicies out there, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
Okay, let's hear about some of them. Which ones are the most popular or influential?
Well, one of the classics is the soul-making theodicy, made popular by the philosopher John Hick.
Soul-making, that's an interesting term.
It is, right. So this theodicy suggests that God allows evil because it's actually necessary for our moral and spiritual development.
So it's like saying suffering is what helps us grow and become better people.
Exactly. We face challenges, make difficult choices, and that ultimately helps us develop morally and spiritually.
Okay, I can see how that might work for some kinds of suffering, but what about suffering that doesn't seem to lead to any kind of growth?
That's a good point, and that's one of the main criticisms of this theodicy. What about the suffering of animals or babies who die before they've even had a chance to make any moral choices?
Yeah, it's hard to see how those kinds of suffering contribute to anyone's moral development.
Right, so it seems like this theodicy can only explain a very specific type of suffering, the kind that we might actually overcome and learn from.
And even then, you could argue that suffering isn't necessary for moral growth, right? Couldn't we learn and grow in other ways?
Absolutely, so it's not a perfect solution by any means.
Okay, so what about other theodicies? I've heard of the free will defense. That one seems to be pretty popular.
Yeah, the free will defense is a big one. It argues that God gave humans free will, and that evil is basically a side effect of that gift.
So the idea is that a world with free will, even if it means there's going to be some evil, is better than a world where we're all just robots programmed to do good.
Exactly. Having the freedom to choose means having the freedom to choose badly, and unfortunately, that sometimes leads to suffering.
Okay, I get that, but doesn't that only explain suffering that's caused by humans? What about natural disasters, diseases, all the bad things that happen that aren't really our fault?
That's one of the limitations of the free will defense. For sure, it does a good job of explaining moral evil, the suffering we inflict on each other,
Right.
but it struggles to explain natural evil, the suffering that just seems to come from the world itself.
Right, like earthquakes, tsunamis, those aren't caused by human choices.
Exactly. So some philosophers have tried to expand the free will defense to include natural evil.
Okay, how do they do that?
They suggest that maybe God allows natural disasters and stuff to happen so that we have opportunities to exercise our free will in responding to them.
So, like, we can choose to help others, show compassion, build resilience in the face of tragedy.
Exactly. It's like those natural disasters become tests of character.
Hmm, interesting. But it still doesn't really explain why those tests have to be so devastating, or why some people seem to get hit with way more suffering than others.
Yeah, and it kind of makes you wonder why a good and all-powerful God couldn't find less destructive ways to test us, right?
Right. Like, why does it have to be so extreme?
It's a tough question, and that's why philosophers have come up with even more theodicies and defenses.
Oh boy, so there are even more.
Oh, yeah. There's one that focuses on the value of having the freedom to do not just good, but also great evil.
Okay, wait, what? The freedom to do great evil. That seems counterintuitive.
It's a bit of a head scratcher. I know the argument is that the capacity for really profound love and goodness is somehow tied to the capacity for really profound wickedness.
So, like, a world with saints also needs the possibility of monsters.
Yeah, something like that. But of course, you can ask, does that really justify the existence of those monsters and all the suffering they cause?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a very satisfying answer.
Definitely a controversial one. And it still doesn't address the problem of natural evil. So then you have theodicies that try to explain suffering by appealing to the inherent goodness of natural laws.
Oh, right. Like the idea that a world governed by predictable laws
Mm.
is better than a completely chaotic world, even if those laws sometimes lead to suffering.
Exactly. Like, it's good that gravity exists, even though it means people can fall and get hurt, right?
Right, because otherwise we'd be floating around uncontrollably, and that would be even worse.
Exactly. So proponents of this view would say that a world where the laws of nature were constantly changing would be way worse, even if it meant less suffering overall.
But then, couldn't a benevolent and all-powerful God create a world with natural laws that are both predictable and don't cause so much unnecessary suffering?
It's a good question, and it kind of brings us back to square one, questioning God's power and goodness.
Right, it seems like we keep running into that same wall.
It's a persistent dilemma, and it leads us to that third category of responses, defenses.
Okay, defenses. How are those different from theodicies? They both seem to be trying to justify God's actions when it comes to evil.
Yeah, there's definitely some overlap, and the terms are sometimes used interchangeably.
Okay.
But there is a subtle distinction. The Odysseys try to give you specific explanations for why God allows evil, while defenses are more modest.
Okay.
They just argue that it's likely God has good reasons, even if we don't know what they are.
So it's more like, trust me, God knows what he's doing, even if we can't understand it.
You could put it that way, yeah. But for a defense to be convincing, it needs to offer at least some reason to believe that those unknown reasons are plausible?
So just saying God works in mysterious ways isn't really enough.
Not really, no. You need to give people at least some grounds for thinking that there are good reasons, even if we're not privy to them.
It definitely seems like defenses require a certain degree of faith. You have to trust that there are justifications that are beyond our comprehension.
It's a leap of faith, for sure, but there are some variations of defenses and theodicies that try to ground that faith in something more than just blind trust.
Okay, how so?
Well, one approach is to shift the focus away from individual instances of evil and look at the bigger picture, the overall picture of the universe.
Right, like that idea we talked about earlier, that maybe a certain amount of evil is necessary for the overall good of the universe.
Exactly. Maybe a world without any suffering would actually be flawed in some way, even if we can't understand how.
It's kind of a mind-blowing thought, isn't it?
It is, and this approach often uses the concept of global property.
Global properties, what are those?
These are like features of the world as a whole that are valuable, but might require the existence of some evil as a counterpart. It's like saying, sure, this specific instance of suffering is terrible, but it's somehow part of a larger cosmic tapestry that ultimately results in more good than bad.
But how can we even know if those global properties actually exist? And even if they do, how can we be sure that they outweigh the suffering they seem to require?
You're getting to the heart of the matter. The problem with this kind of defense is that it relies on things we have no direct knowledge of. We're basically being asked to accept that there are good reasons for suffering, even though we have no idea what they are.
It seems like we keep running into the same wall. We can try to explain away suffering, appeal to unknown reasons, shift our focus to the big picture, but the problem of individual suffering keeps coming back.
It does, and that brings us back to that example of Sue, the young girl who was brutally murdered. That case, and countless others like it, force us to move beyond these theoretical arguments and confront the raw, visceral reality of evil.
It's a stark reminder that this isn't just an intellectual game, it's about real people and real pain.
Exactly, and it's in those moments when we're faced with that kind of senseless suffering that many of the theodicies and defenses we've discussed seem to fall short. They might offer plausible explanations for some types of suffering, but they struggle to account for cases like Sue's, where the suffering just seems so gratuitous and pointless.
So where does that leave us? We've journeyed through this complex philosophical landscape, but we haven't really found a definitive answer. Are we at a dead end?
I wouldn't say we're at a dead end, even if we can't definitively solve the problem of evil. The very process of engaging with it can still be incredibly valuable.
Okay, I can see that it forces us to think critically about our beliefs and the world around us.
Exactly. It pushes us to confront the limits of our understanding and grapple with some of the deepest mysteries of human existence.
Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. I feel like my brain has been through a philosophical ringer after our last two discussions.
I know, right? It's like we've been climbing Mount Everest of philosophical problems, and the air's getting a little thin up here.
It is. We spent the last two parts of this deep dive really digging into the problem of evil. Breaking down the arguments, looking at all the different ways philosophers have tried to tackle this age-old question.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It has, and I think one thing's for sure, there's no easy answer. This isn't a problem with a simple solution.
You're telling me it's more like a giant maze with a million different paths, and most of them lead to dead ends.
Exactly, which can be pretty frustrating, especially when you consider how emotionally charged this whole issue is. It's not just an abstract intellectual puzzle.
Right. It's about real people and real suffering.
Yeah, we've all experienced suffering in one way or another, whether directly or indirectly, and it's natural to want answers, to want to make sense of it.
Absolutely. And that's where those philosophical abstractions we've been talking about can sometimes feel a little, well, insufficient.
Okay, so how do we bridge that gap?
Well, I think it helps to remember specific cases, like the example we talked about earlier, Rose's example of Sue, that young girl who was brutally murdered.
Right, that one was really hard to hear about.
It was. And it's cases like that, countless others like it, that force us to move beyond the theoretical and confront the raw, visceral reality of evil.
That's where it really hits home. It's one thing to debate the logic of God and evil, but it's a whole other level when you're trying to make sense of a specific, senseless tragedy.
And that's where a lot of the theodicies and defenses we talked about start to struggle. They might offer explanations for some types of suffering, but they just don't seem to hold up when faced with something like Sue's case.
Yeah, like how can any amount of soul-making or greater good possibly justify that kind of horrific suffering, especially when it happens to an innocent child?
It's a question that continues to haunt us, and it's a question that, honestly, each person has to wrestle with on their own.
So where does that leave us? I mean, we spend all this time exploring this problem, but we haven't really found a definitive solution. So are we just stuck?
I wouldn't say we're stuck, no. I think even if we can't solve the problem of evil, the process of wrestling with it can still be incredibly valuable.
Okay, I can see that. Like, it forces us to examine our own beliefs, to really think about the world around us.
Exactly. It pushes us to confront the limits of our understanding and grapple with some of the biggest questions out there.
It's like that saying, sometimes the journey is more important than the destination, right?
Yeah, I think the Stanford Encyclopedia made a good point about that. Even if we don't arrive at a solution that satisfies everyone, just the act of grappling with the problem of evil can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world we live in.
Okay, so for our listeners who've been on this journey with us, what are some of the key takeaways we can leave them with?
Well, first and foremost, I hope they've gained an appreciation for just how complex this problem really is. It's not a simple matter of faith versus reason. It's this multifaceted puzzle that has challenged some of the brightest minds throughout history.
We've seen how philosophers have tackled it from all these different angles, using logic, ethics, metaphysics, even probability theory.
Right, we've looked at arguments that try to show God and evil just can't coexist, and arguments that say evil just makes God's existence less likely.
And then we went through all those theodicies and defenses, some more convincing than others, but each trying to make sense of suffering within the framework of a loving, all-powerful God.
And we talked about how important it is to look at this problem from both abstract and concrete perspectives. Those philosophical arguments are crucial, but we can't forget the actual lived experiences of suffering that make this issue so powerful and so personal.
And I think, for me, one of the most interesting parts of this whole deep dive has been exploring the idea of global properties.
Oh, yeah, those are pretty mind-blowing.
It's just wild to think that maybe there's some greater good out there that requires a certain amount of evil to exist, even if we can't comprehend it.
Yeah, it really makes you realize how limited our perspective might be.
Maybe the point isn't to find a definitive answer, you know. Maybe it's more about the journey of questioning, exploring, trying to make sense of a world that often doesn't give us easy explanations.
That's a beautiful way to put it. I think you hit the nail on the head. Thanks. The problem of evil, as daunting as it is, ultimately invites us to delve deeper into what it means to be human, to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge, and to keep searching for meaning, even when faced with uncertainty.
It's a tough journey for sure, but it's a journey worth taking.
I agree.
So to everyone listening, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for those glimmers of understanding, even when things feel dark and confusing.
And remember, even though we may never have all the answers, just the act of seeking them can change us in profound ways.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the problem of evil. Until next time.